primera mesa le pedimos que suban Svati Sa de la Universidad de Massachusetts y le damos las gracias por estar aquí. A Saint Planbeck, Danish Institute for International Studies. Gracias también a Saint René Leiva del Instituto Nacional de Salud Pública. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Esta mesa la va a moderar Andrea González del programa VIH-Sida del Gobierno del Distrito Federal. Y bueno, quien va a comentar esta mesa va a ser el doctor Mario Luis Fuentes de la Cátedra Extraordinaria sobre Trata de Personas, así que bienvenidas, bienvenidos y muchísimas gracias por estar aquí.
Bueno, pues muy buenos días en este foro de sexo, poder y dinero que tiene pues un lleno total. Afortunadamente en el interés despertado en un tema que es en este momento tan importante, que está modificando las vidas de personas que de por sí vivían en situaciones muy difíciles. Entonces vamos a pasar sin más a la primera presentación de la Universidad de Massachusetts, Swat Sat.
Hello, good morning. My name is Swati Shah. I'm an anthropologist who teaches at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. I am so happy to be here this morning with all of you, and I wish to express my sincere thanks to the university, to the many organizations and departments and institutions that made our visit here possible, and of course to Anna Amachastagui, who actually coordinated us and brought us here with her amazing team. I'm going to switch between a more informal presentation and a presentation from my book, which is called Street Corner Secrets, Sex, Work, and Migration in the City of Mumbai, that was published in late 2014. The image that you see above me is from the book, and it is an image from a 2004 sex workers meeting in India, in the southern state of Kerala, where some 6,000 people participated. Many of them were sex workers, many of them were also advocates for sex workers. And one thing that I think this image shows is that we are not just talking about the phenomenon of sex work, but we are also talking about how that phenomenon is talked about. And this is not a kind of abstract theoretical idea about representation, but a very deep concern actually about how the representation of sex work contributes to policies that affect sex work very profoundly. So the policy that I am particularly concerned with as somebody who has done research on sex work, or what I more broadly call sexual commerce, is the policy of criminalization, of trying to eradicate any form of paying for a sexual service in the name of reducing violence against women. And based on my own research, and also based on the field of research that my work is part of, myself and my colleagues have over and over again come to the conclusion that criminalization actually does not reduce violence against sex work, although it intends to do that. What it more often does, and I think quite unintentionally, is it actually promotes conditions that make violence and vulnerability more active in the lives of people who sell sexual services. So I want to be very clear at the outset that, like my colleagues, I am very, very concerned about violence. I wish my work to contribute to reducing violence for any vulnerable people, but certainly for women, and certainly for women who are selling sexual services to survive. But in order to reduce violence, I feel we have to understand how violence operates in our understandings of sexual commerce in the policy world. So let me tell you a little bit about how I've come to some of these conclusions and then kind of talk more broadly about what some of these conclusions are. The way I have come to some of these conclusions is by doing a field research project on sexual commerce in the city of Mumbai. Mumbai is one of India's largest cities. It's a very iconic city, like Mexico City or New York or London. It's the city that people know when they think of India. One of the things that's also very iconic about Mumbai is its red light districts. It has some of the most famous red light districts in the world, and when I say famous, I also mean infamous. A lot of films are made about people working in brothels in Mumbai. In the early 1980s, photographers from New York would go with their cameras to Mumbai and take photographs of sex workers there and sort of say, look, you know, I found the most poor, most abject person in the world, and it's a sex worker in Mumbai. So this kind of image of poverty, of abjection, of the kind of abject person, ultimate abject person being an Indian sex worker is actually generated in a large part from this particular place in Mumbai. I wanted to go to study sexual commerce in Mumbai starting in the 1990s. The first time I went to the red light district in Mumbai was in 1996. And I went there to study HIV prevention efforts there because there was a lot of HIV, very interesting, very radical, cutting-edge HIV prevention efforts in Mumbai because there was also a lot of HIV, a lot of fear of HIV infection in those places. Over time, I realized that there's a story about sex work that people in the red light district are also participating in. So whenever I would ask, what is the condition of your work, they would say, I'm here and it's not my fault. And I found this very strange, that there is a narrative about sexual commerce that actually preceded me and that I found very fascinating, that people felt they had to respond to something that I hadn't even asked them. So this has led to a very long engagement, not only with the red light district, but also with places where poor migrants seek paid work in Mumbai, and sometimes that work is construction work, and sometimes it is sex work. So my project and the book that I mentioned actually talks about 3 places in Mumbai where people sell sexual services very differently. It talks about the red light districts, but it also talks about a street where women solicit clients for sex and they are classified as street-based sex workers. And it also talks about a day-wage labor market, a place where migrants go to solicit contracts for hard manual labor. One thing I realized that's actually similar among all of these sites is that everyone is from a very rural community. In that community, they do not own land. They are agricultural workers in that community. They do very hard physical labor on farms. And they find it very, very hard to survive in those places, so they move to the city to look for paid work there, because the paid work there is better paid, they can send money home. And I think this flow of migrants from rural places to cities is very common, particularly throughout the Global South. And I know certainly from speaking with our colleagues in Brigada that this is a phenomenon that people, all of you are also very, very familiar with. One thing that I thought was very striking was that in the literature, migrant day-wage workers and sex workers are never talked about together. So if we're talking about sex workers, they are seen as an exceptional category. They are not seen as one group of migrant workers who have a specific set of constraints, of problems, of sort of specific context, but you know, they're all can kind of be understood as migrant workers. And the reason for this is the trafficking discourse. So I want to first say that when I spoke with people who were doing sex work in any of these places, they all had very, very complicated livelihood histories. they also had a very complicated relationship with where and how they did sex work, but it would be very hard to say that any of them was totally a victim. It would also be very hard to say that any of them had been trafficked in the sense of kind of the popular sense, which is the, this idea that somebody is literally taken from their home, put somewhere, forced to do prostitution, not allowed to go outside, that kind of very like colloquial understanding of trafficking. They did not conform to that understanding, nor did they conform to the official understanding which is enshrined in the Palermo Protocol, which some of my other colleagues may speak about later. So I thought it was very unusual that these people are thought of as trafficked because they're doing sex work, but actually none of them conform to this definition of trafficking, and they have very complicated livelihood histories. So, as a researcher, I thought, well, why is this? Because clearly the data that I am collecting, my observations, and the observations of many of my colleagues do not match the idea of prostitution in the policy framework that is saying, in order to protect these women, we have to criminalize sexual commerce. So I think that there are a few reasons, theoretical reasons, why there's this disconnect between what we're seeing on the ground and what policy is happening around this issue. And the main difference in these two zones is in the understanding of violence. So in the policy world, when people are arguing for criminalizing sex work, and let's make no mistake, they're talking about criminalizing sex work because they wish to abolish sex work, right? So in English, we kind of call that an abolitionist perspective on sexual commerce. In this abolitionist perspective, sex work or any sexual commerce is the cause of violence. The theoretical understanding is that sexual commerce causes violence. So of course, logically it makes sense. If something causes violence, you get rid of the thing that causes the violence and then the violence goes away, right? What we're seeing on the ground is something quite different. So if you do use a labor framework, which is the framework that I am using to think about, how sex work fits into other host of livelihood strategies for people, you sort of realize that perhaps it's criminalization that causes violence. Why would criminalization cause violence? Criminalization would cause violence for a number of reasons, and I think the biggest reason that criminalization would cause violence is that criminalization relies on agents of the state, like the police, to enforce the laws that criminalize whatever you're trying to get rid of, right? Unfortunately, as we all probably know, empowering the police to criminalize a certain activity also creates a larger space for police to behave with impunity. So when I asked the people that I was speaking with, particularly the people who were doing sex work full-time, tell me about the violence you experience, the first thing they would say is, we experience violence from the police. And some of them even said, we understand that some of the things we are doing are illegal. Like, for example, soliciting clients for sex work is illegal in India as it is in Mexico. It's not illegal specifically to exchange sex for money. That is not illegal in the law, but soliciting is illegal. So they would say, we understand solicitation is illegal, but show us where in the law it says the police has to hit us. Show us where in the law it says that we have to be beaten by the police. Because that was their primary experience of the police. The other thing that criminalization does to sexual commerce in particular is it removes access to the rule of law for sex workers. So if a woman is doing sex work and the law is violated in her name, if she experiences a robbery, if she is physically assaulted, if she experiences sexual violence, that person does not have recourse to the law, right? She cannot report a crime to the police because she's already a criminal. So For these two reasons, I think one argument that I'm trying to make in my work very strongly is that although criminalization aims to reduce violence against sex workers, it actually, perhaps inadvertently, increases the violence that sex workers experience. Now, we could ask, if we think about this abolitionist perspective on sex work and then this other perspective, which I would loosely call a labor perspective on sex work, we could ask, why are there such different perspectives on this? And that is a very interesting question. It is a potentially endless question. It is a question that many of us spend a lot of time thinking about. I'm actually not going to address that question directly. What I would like to do instead is talk about what makes these different perspectives work. How do these different perspectives function? So, there are two ways actually that the abolitionist perspective functions, because any perspective, it needs a kind of logic to make itself intelligible, right? It needs to make certain connections. So for example, as I've already said, in the abolitionist perspective, violence is seen as an effect of sexual commerce, right? Instead of what I'm saying, which is criminalization. So I think there's two ways that we can distinguish a labor perspective from an abolitionist perspective. In the abolitionist perspective, there are two sets of conflations. There are two different ways that two sets of concepts are made to be equivalent to one another. So the first set of conflations is a conflation of prostitution and trafficking. Right? Prostitution is seen as the same thing as trafficking. Even though in our empirical studies, we see trafficking and prostitution are actually two very different things. And if we think about trafficking, we see a lot more trafficking in the classical sense, in the kind of Palermo Protocol, UN sense, in other industries, in sweatshop labor, in carpet manufacturing, in these kind of special economic zones where people are making clothes and watches and phones for Apple and things like that, where people actually, their passports are taken away, they can't leave, their wages are not given. That more classical sense of trafficking we're seeing in other industries. But in the abolitionist perspective on sex work, we see that prostitution and trafficking are made to mean the same thing. The second set of conflations is conflating agency and choice. So a lot of times when I debate with my abolitionist colleagues, the answer that I get is, well, you're just saying that everybody who's doing sex work is fine. You think that they are empowered and they are just choosing to do this, and you are ignoring all the ways that they don't have choice. And I would say, actually, I don't think anybody is fine. Nobody's fine, and they're getting less fine all the time. And the reason they're getting less fine all the time is because we have removed an important conceptual tool from our toolkit. We have removed actual agency. The classical philosophical understanding of agency is not choice. It is the capacity to act. So it is not the action itself, but the capacity that produces, contextualizes, enables the action. So in that sense, everyone has agency. It's just a question of how much agency they have, right? If people have a constrained set of choices, they negotiate within those choices. If they have a broader set of choices, they negotiate within those set of choices. Instead of thinking about a kind of collectivized, contextualized form of agency, I'm afraid that policies have been driven by a very individualized idea of choice. So in a world in which all we have is a group of individuals that are good or bad and do good or bad things to other individuals, we will not really be able to address questions of vulnerability, of neoliberalism, of poverty in a way that is not only broadly contextualized, but that also accounts for the politics of how a debate like a debate between abolitionism and labor is produced in relation to sexual commerce. I will end there and welcome any questions afterward. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias y vamos ahora con la segunda presentación. Kerwin Kane es doctor en análisis social y cultural por New York University, maestro en antropología de la Universidad del Estado de San Francisco, profesor en sociología en la Universidad de Wesleyan. Sus trabajos se centran en la historia y la realidad actual del trabajo sexual masculino, así como el impacto negativo de las políticas contemporáneas contra la trata. También escribe sobre abusos dentro de los programas de rehabilitación de drogas patrocinados por el sistema de justicia penal de Estados Unidos, así como sobre la dinámica de género de estos programas.
Buenos dias. Thank you for having me here. That would be very confusing. It's really an honor to be here at UNAM, so thank you for having me. In 2000, I spent approximately a year working with a harm reduction agency and conducting ethnographic research with male street-based sex workers in San Francisco. Most were between 16 and 19 years old and had run away from home or been thrown out by their parents, often because they were gay. Although the UN General Assembly had adopted the Palermo Protocol on trafficking that same year, no one in the social service agencies used that term, sex trafficking, to describe the young men to whom I gave food, syringes, and condoms. Now, some 15 years later, the sex trafficking framework is widely used to discuss underage girls involved in sex work, but the frame is applied to boys only very rarely, and the agencies that provide services to youth in the area continue to use terms like at-risk youth or homeless youth. Although a small number of service agencies that work with male youth are slowly adopting the new trafficking framework, women and girls remain the primary subjects of discussions of so-called sex trafficking and sexual slavery. Though there are indeed some differences in the conditions faced by male, female, and also transgender workers who work on the street, I argue that the primary reason the sex trafficking framework has not been applied to male or transgender youth has more to do with the gendered nature of the sex trafficking narrative than with any objective material differences in the conditions on the street. Today, I wish to detail the discursive dichotomization of these frameworks, examining how these discourses act as gendered and gendering formations more generally. Following this, I critically examine the growing inclusion of boys as victims, arguing that the sex trafficking frame is less useful and more harmful than it may first appear. While anti-trafficking activists portray themselves as being involved in a humanitarian venture, their efforts generate problematic dynamics that are common to many projects facilitated by outside helpers, particularly when those allegedly humanitarian projects align themselves with the powers of the state. I want to start with an insight from the anthropologist and feminist scholar of sexuality, Carol Vance, concerning the way in which melodrama structures the sex trafficking narrative. So if you think of the classic melodramatic narrative, to simplify it to the extreme, there are basically three elements. There's a good guy, a bad guy, and a damsel in distress. And the basic plot line most typically envisions a malicious and evil male villain who attempts to seduce or otherwise threaten the sexual purity of a conventionally attractive and sexually innocent young woman. The woman appears unable to defend herself, but fortunately, the usually light-skinned and invariably handsome hero vanquishes the villain and rescues the damsel before her sexual honor is compromised, culminating in a happily ever after scene of romantically tinged conjugal bliss. This basic plotline, literary historians suggest, emerged sometime in the mid-1700s, at approximately the same moment and in association with the rise of nationalism. And since that time, this genre of melodrama has offered a platform through which, on the one hand, relations between groups of male-defined polities are positioned and understood in conflicts between the hero and the villain, as well as, on the other hand, providing an important means through which debates around gender have occurred. So one sees this melodramatic form being used not only in narratives of the nation, but also in colonial writings and anti-colonial writings, both in stories of male dominance and, ironically, in stories used to challenge certain elements of male dominance. So this melodramatic narrative, featuring the central characters of hero, villain, and damsel in distress, has been significant in the formation of both counter-hegemonic collectivities as well as hegemonic ones, even as it creates a common narrative regarding gender and sexuality, and specifically a common narrative that builds male agency and female sexual vulnerability as central cultural elements. Given the way in which melodrama addresses itself to sexual honor, it is not surprising to find it centrally located in shaping much of the discourse concerning prostitution. The image of the prostitute lies on one side of the virgin-whore dichotomy that is used to police women's sexuality more generally. This means that discussions concerning the nature of prostitution or sex work have implications for the status of women more generally. And this is true in ways that discussions of male prostitution are not positioned in the same way to comment upon the status of all men. So while discussions concerning female prostitution play directly into melodramatic narratives that are used in the heroic construction of the normative nation, discussions concerning male prostitution or transgender prostitution are rendered socially dead. They are filled with topics that people would rather not discuss and are positioned as manifestations of individual pathology that do not implicate the nation as a whole. It is not surprising then that many feminist groups have taken up the issue of female prostitution as part of their campaigns. The female sex worker comes to represent the position of all women, or at least the threat imposed against all women, and defending the female prostitute from the brutality of men's supposedly natural sexual desires creates a way in which feminists symbolically defend the sexual virtue of all women against the evil villains who would sexually violate their innocence. But in holding so closely to the melodramatic narrative, these feminists ironically replicate the sexism of the national story. And the key to seeing this is what happens when the alleged victim is not someone who can represent a viable damsel in distress. First slide. To make a good damsel in distress, the woman must be young, conventionally attractive, and sexually virtuous, with all the qualities pertaining to a future spouse to the melodramatic hero. She must not do drugs. She must not choose at any level to engage in sex work. She must not be transgender. She must be sexually desirable and yet innocent. She must not exercise agency, particularly any agency that would undercut her legitimacy to act as a future mother of the nation. In other words, she must be normative. Feminist representations of sexual trafficking often go out of their way to emphasize the normativity of the victims they discuss. The images used in anti-trafficking campaigns often rely upon conventionally attractive models whose youth speaks to their innocence. In order to emphasize the worth of the whore, anti-trafficking campaigns often seek to turn the women into virtuous victims whose future value as a sexual subject is destroyed by evil men. The melodramatic narrative of sexual slavery not only reinforces the idea that a woman's sexual honor is her most valuable asset, but it also works hard to reinforce the idea that women in sex work exercise no agency whatsoever, often through the portrayal of situations of extreme violence or extreme youth. Feminists who oppose sexual trafficking often believe that they are fighting women's inclusion into an increasingly commoditized form of sexuality that disadvantages and oppresses women. Yet as numerous scholars who are critical of the anti-trafficking framework have pointed out, this symbolic protest fails to capture the reality lived by the overwhelming majority of sex workers. Far from being helpless damsels in distress, nearly all individuals engaged in sex work continue to make decisions in their lives, even if, within circumstances, that are constrained by poverty, racism, constraints on migration, and systems of patriarchal domination. While anti-trafficking activists claim to be rescuing women from sexual slavery, the reality is that anti-trafficking policies fail to engage in the real issues confronted by most sex workers, and instead make those conditions even worse. As I mentioned at the outset, my own interest in this issue rises from my work with young men who sold sex on the streets in San Francisco. The young men I worked with, and I should say I did not take these photos, but the images give you some idea as to what the young men I worked with were like. The young men I worked with were not innocents in any sense of the word. Most use heroin or methamphetamine, and most worked hard to present a tough image on the street in an effort to hide their vulnerability and ward off theft or attack. Although they turned tricks on the street to get money to eat, to get money for housing, and to get money for drugs, they would have laughed at the idea that they were weak in any way. As I mentioned earlier, when I conducted my fieldwork in 2000, the idea of sex trafficking did not much exist. Today, the failure of anti-trafficking NGOs and police agencies to find many people who fit into the unrealistic criteria established by legal definitions of trafficking has pushed these organizations into a search for greater numbers of victims. This search has brought them to focus on youth under the age of 18, whose status as minors means that any involvement in sex work is automatically classified as trafficking, even if no coercion or force is directly involved, and indeed, even if there's no third-party involvement of any sort. As half of the youth selling sex on the street are males, this constitutes an untapped market for NGOs who are eager to demonstrate numerical relevance to their funders. But just as the sex trafficking framework ignores the genuine needs of female sex workers and generally makes their situation worse, it also ignores the genuine needs of young men and transgender individuals doing sex work on the street. And in the rest of my time here today, I want to briefly talk about the negative consequences that these young men have been facing as the sex trafficking framework has been introduced. As I have suggested already, the melodramatic narration of sex trafficking focuses upon the alleged dangers of commercial sex, while de-emphasizing any agency that the youth might exercise. In effect, all of the problems of the street, all of the poverty, all of the hunger, all of the constant hustle to find a place to sleep, all of the fears that youth have of others who might steal from them, all of the abuse suffered in their families, all of the anti-gay and anti-transgender bigotries that many of these youth confront, all of this is reduced to a single issue: sex. This narrow focus upon the issue of sexual vulnerability ignores the problem-filled context in which youth often practice sex work, or perhaps another term we might use in this particular context, practice survival sex, and makes the actions of these youths impossible to understand without reference to often fantastical stories of extreme coercion. In point of fact, these young men must balance whatever dangers or discomforts they experience in commercial sex with their needs to obtain food and shelter, as well as purchases for more risky items such as drugs. The narrowed version of sexual slavery thus blinds us to a central fact, namely that many of these youths embrace prostitution as a possibly problematic solution to their problems, rather than the problem in and of itself. In the name of rescuing these trafficking victims, police agencies, the same police who harass and often abuse street youth, have increasingly been called in to arrest these youth and force them into group homes. One might ask, for example, why more of these youths do not enter these homes on a voluntary basis. By tightly enforced curfews, prohibitions against drugs and prostitution, and requirements to notify one's parents of one's whereabouts made life on the street seem more attractive to many of them. The impact of forcing such youth to accept services are at best unclear, and as I witnessed in my study, the young men often reacted with hostility when helpers attempt to coercively impose their vision of aid. And indeed, the systematic inability of these organizations to understand the needs of street youth should raise questions. Many street youth, in fact, experience these institutions as forms of imprisonment that violently assault their identities. Youths are often made to recount their traumatic experiences with commercial sex again and again, even when they did not experience these situations in that way. In some cases, organizations run by evangelical groups further attempt to cure youth who identify as gay or transgender, turning these institutions into another form of violence that many sought to escape by leaving their families in the first place. Meanwhile, issues pertaining to youth homelessness and its root causes are ignored, as are interventions that might work to alleviate the problems that street youth face. The melodrama of sex trafficking offers an easy-to-understand narrative of good versus evil, complete with dramatic stories of daring rescue of morally virtuous and conventionally attractive young women from an unambiguously evil and mostly non-white men in the US context. A new template for understanding is warranted, one that recognizes the complexity of confronting multiple difficulties simultaneously, and that demands more than a dichotomous understanding of morality. We must find ways to apprehend a world infused with shades of gray and to offer meaningful forms of support to those who need it. Including men and boys within the discourse of sex trafficking is a move in the wrong direction. The actual need is to dismantle the melodramatic narrative of sex trafficking entirely, replacing it with a frame that is more responsive to the manifold, diverse realities of the sex industry. An alternate narrative should move toward complex and multifaceted analysis that makes experiential diversity visible among sex workers. Cultural narratives associated with harm reduction offer one possible alternative. Whereas melodrama tends to generate simplistic solutions that ignore the lived experiences of those it seeks to help in order to address a single, narrowly defined problem, harm reduction approaches begin with a sense of respect for the wishes of participants. While it must be carefully remembered that there are many, many sex workers who find sex work to be no more problematic than any other job, even in cases where situations of exploitation and extreme exploitation exist, an alternative to the narrative of sex trafficking must be found. Thank you.
Vamos a darle ahora la palabra a Sine Plambes. Ella es postdoctorada en Antropología Social, investigadora del Instituto Danés de Estudios Internacionales y colaboradora de Columbia University. Ha colaborado para varios medios de comunicación, entre ellos el New York Times, CNN, y ha llevado el debate público nacional e internacional de migración y trata, y combina la investigación con el activismo y el documental cinematográfico.
Okay, thank you everyone, and thank you for inviting me here today. My name is Sine Plambes. I'm an anthropologist and filmmaker from the Danish Institute of International Studies. The title of my talk today is Between Victims and Criminals: Rescue, Deportation, and Everyday Violence in the Lives of Nigerian Sex Worker Migrants After Deportation from Europe. What I will discuss today is about the lives of a group of Nigerian women who migrated to Europe in search of better opportunities and earned a living by selling sex on the streets in European cities. In Europe, some of the women were involved in situations that fit the country's legal definitions of human trafficking, and as such, they were identified and categorized as victims of human trafficking. Others were categorized as undocumented immigrants, criminals violating immigration laws by lacking the required documentation to live and work in Europe. Yet all of them ended up being returned or deported to Nigeria, though some of them were promised temporary humanitarian reintegration assistance upon return as victims of human trafficking. In the first part of my talk, I will provide the context for understanding Nigerian women's migration, how it is practiced, and how I define their experiences in the light of the debates on trafficking. In the second part, I discuss what happens after what is called trafficking. What happens after selling sex in Europe? What happens after deportation? Because despite the vast public and political attention that has been devoted to human trafficking, studies of sex workers returning to their native countries are few. But first, Nigeria is the main non-EU country of origin of officially identified victims of trafficking. And by officially, I mean identified by state authorities. And Nigerians are also among the top 5 nationalities residing undocumented in the EU. So here we already see how some end up identified as victims, whereas others are just considered undocumented. Separating between these two groups is a very complex and often arbitrary process because they cannot neatly be separated. The talk is based on a multi-local ethnography, primarily in Copenhagen and Benin City, also called Benin in southern Nigeria. Benin City, in popular language called Benin, has received significant attention in media, political and popular discourse as a place from where Nigerian sex workers originate. And indeed, it is estimated that up to 85% of Nigerian women selling sex in Europe originated in or passed through Benin on their way to Europe. The connections in Benin to Europe are evident. There's a shop called Little Italy Plaza, and the town has its own hotel Torino. Nigerian migrants working in Italy own both businesses. Benin has the largest concentration of property development in Nigeria through remittances that originate in Europe, and the newly built houses, of which many are owned by Nigerian women in Italy, serve as billboards displaying the potential success for potential migrants. Several signs advertise courses in Spanish, Italian, French, and Swedish taught by return migrants to prepare prospective migrants for their upcoming journeys. Oh, sorry, we are not there yet. Aspiring migrants depart on minibuses for Libya and Morocco, journeying on high-risk routes through the Sahara Desert, followed by potentially deadly sea journeys across the Mediterranean to Europe. International donors and Nigerian government funding have financed locally televised anti-trafficking warnings and billboards. They warn potential women migrants in Benin against the dangers of being lured into sex trafficking. But when I talked to the women themselves, they knew quite well what kind of jobs awaited them in Europe. And a survey of about 700 villagers living outside Benin showed that they all know this too. So the dangers of trafficking and the danger of sex work and migration depends upon whether you ask authorities, NGOs, or the women themselves. For the women that I followed, migration to Europe was first and foremost a livelihood strategy. And although the women's earnings might not flow steadily to Nigeria and might be less than the woman and her family had hoped for, the remittances still provided a livelihood and access to some kind of financial security. Here we go. So, my point of departure for exploring the concept of trafficking in an anthropological perspective is that we cannot simply assume that we know what trafficking is. That is, when migration ends and human trafficking begin varies according to political and moral values not easily captured by legal definitions. This discussion often circulates around the question of consent. Under what condition does a person consent to sell sex or consent to migrate to Europe? And who is to decide the scale of consent involved? Therefore, we have to explore the ethnographic details in each context. How is Nigerian women's migration arranged in the first place? Strict European border controls have made it more expensive for undocumented migrants during the past 15 years, to cross European borders, requiring them to become indebted to a criminal migration industry securing their passing. The way the migration typically is organized is that the women or their families contacted individuals or were contacted by them, the so-called sponsors or madams, whom they knew could provide them with travel documents and arrange their trip to Europe for prices ranging between $12,000 US to exorbitant $50,000 to $60,000 US. The women in this study did not know all of the conditions and hazards involved in their job in Europe. Yet they knew, except one, that they were going to sell sex. They also knew that they would work under a madam, and they had anticipated 2 to 3 years of hard work while repaying their debt. By then, although that rarely happened, they had hoped to have repaid their madams and worked for themselves. In the Nigerian context, this arrangement, therefore, I argue, is one of indenture. And what do I mean by that? I define it by borrowing money, agreeing to work off the debt, sometimes under restrictive contracts in a foreign country, in exchange for passage, accommodation, food, and information. It is potentially highly exploitative situation, such as unfree labor, increase in debt, and undocumented status. And it might also, in a legal framework, at times be defined as human trafficking. Choosing between indenture and poverty, the women choose indenture. Despite the women's limited possibilities and that the women were not conscious of all the risks involved, I find it crucial to acknowledge the women as persons making autonomous decisions, although obviously on a limited stage. Yet the women in this study did not necessarily feel exploited because they sold sex. More often, when they were in Europe, they would feel exploited and deceived by their madams or other actors when they realized the difficulties of living undocumented in Europe, constantly trying to escape the police, the prices of food and other necessities, which meant it would take them much longer to pay off their debt. The racism and sexual violence they encountered in the streets, their random, scruffy and expensive accommodation options, and their lack of access to the formal labor market or healthcare. By using the term indentured sex work migration, I want to pay attention to the ways in which contemporary migrant labor and labor exploitation is organized, and the ways in which debt is a significant, yet often analytically overlooked part of this organizing. That is, I argue that human trafficking, like this, or indentured sex work migration, is not a problem that occurs randomly. It's not a problem that occurs randomly. Neither is it merely about patriarchy or prostitution. Rather, I understand the rubric of trafficking and indentured labor as a structurally situated phenomenon in the context of contemporary political economy and labor migration regimes. Let us here see how Becky, one of the women that I met in Nigeria, who have attempted twice to go to Europe but didn't succeed, explains this arrangement. And this is from my latest film, Becky's Journey. And now I hope the sound works and everything works.
I don't eat meat every day. The meat is very coarse. Don't just eat meat like that every day. After my diploma, I started to make another preparation for my next traveling. They told me that this Libya route, that people are going to Libya, that they are crossing from Libya to Italy. So I now said I would go. But then I didn't pay any money because the woman sponsoring my traveling, she's in Italy, so she's the one sending all the money to me. There's no job in Europe for us. It's just prostitution. So I don't know how to say it, but I'm going there to do it. This is what I'm going there for. I'll pay her money, then I'll continue with my life. she's sending the money through a boy called David. So the boy is the one that is taking us to Libya. So the boy took 36 of us, but different sponsors. So they now paid the boy everything, all the transport fare, all the way from Edo State to Libya.
So Becky still hasn't made it to Europe. After traveling through Sahara, she was deported, as she says it, from Libya on her way to Italy. She now lives her life in Benin, spending her time with deportees and women hoping to get to Europe. And she's still making plans to leave. Becky leads me to the second part of my talk. Benin is no longer just a place from which women depart, a city from which to launch migration strategies. It is also emerging as a city of deportation, a place where women arrive disembarking as deportees from Europe. In most countries, being identified as a victim of trafficking does not give direct access to asylum or a humanitarian visa, but rather give access to a so-called assisted voluntary return, a short-term humanitarian assistance package, and a flight ticket back to Nigeria. This dual process of humanitarian rescue projects attempted at assisting victims of human trafficking upon return, and the forced deportation of undocumented migrants imply that specific group of migrants, the exceptions, those considered vulnerable, those identified as victims, get a different kind of attention and treatment than other migrants. But how to define who should be rescued and get humanitarian assistance upon return to Nigeria? And who should be criminalized and deported without a penny? How to differentiate between the victims and the criminals? Which bodies are considered to suffer in a legitimate way? And what happens after this identification between victims and criminals? What does this distinction, primarily constructed by European authorities in this context, mean in Nigeria upon return? These photos are taken by the women themselves in a collaborative project that we did with disposable cameras about their daily lives upon return. They took photos of their church, their room, their reintegration shop, 2 deported men sitting on the outskirts of Benin, and their closest kin, primarily photos of children and women in their families. I discussed the photos with the women, and often we would end up talking about everyday violence. And let me here focus on this theme of violence. The women in this study were victims of armed robberies, rapes, and/or physical violence after their return to Nigeria. And it was rarely, as has often been argued by certain organizations, connected to their debt or their trafficking situation. Thus, the violence the women experienced did not always occur while they were selling sex in Europe, although several had experienced intense violence there too. When I asked the women to compare Europe to Nigeria, they would often tell me that it was safer to sell sex on the streets of Rome or Hamburg than it was to run a food stall in Benin. For the identified victims of trafficking returned to Nigeria, the return processes create a hierarchical structure in which the violence women experience in the sex industry in Europe is imagined to be worse than the everyday violence they experience in Nigeria. The attempt to rate or rank the women's suffering by European and Nigerian governments, among other policymakers, ends up normalizing everyday violence in Nigeria as something the women should just accept, rather than promoting social justice or addressing the wider socio-economic challenges. The everyday violence the women experience illustrate that there is an arbitrariness of differentiating between victims and criminals, because ultimately the women's stories are not different. In areas of Nigeria prone to economic insecurity and gender-based violence, the categories of victim and criminal collapse into and begin to resemble one another once the migrants return to Nigeria. Because of everyday violence, but also because of economic insecurity and family obligations, which apply to both groups of women no matter how they were categorized, while in Europe, this dissonance reflects a distance between the meanings of livelihood, victimhood and violence in European migration law and anti-trafficking discourse and its meaning in migrants' lives. Life after deportation is an individual and often lonely project where migrants, despite the temporary humanitarian embrace of assisted voluntary reintegration programs, end up immersed in structural problems. Basically, we learn about migrants who are of course not merely victims or criminals, but breadwinners. This finding illustrates how anti-trafficking intervention at times tries to be guided by moral certainty and precludes that human suffering can easily be identified, such as identifying who is a victim of trafficking, who is deservable for assistance and who is not. Because everyday violence upon return, family responsibilities and economic hardships were the three major factors interwoven in the social fabric of all the women's lives, which together made the categories of victims and criminals dissolve. Thank you.
Bueno, vamos ahora a darle la palabra al doctor René Leiva Flores. Él es doctor en Sociología por la Universidad de Barcelona, especialista en salud internacional con estudios en la Organización Panamericana de la Salud, es investigador en ciencias médicas del Centro de Investigaciones en Sistemas de Salud del Instituto Nacional de Salud Pública y tiene bajo su responsabilidad proyectos de investigación sobre el tema de migración, salud y derechos humanos en México y 11 países de América Latina, entre los que destaca el proyecto multicéntrico sobre migración y derechos sexuales y reproductivos apoyado por la Fundación Foro.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la invitación aquí a la universidad. Venir siempre es un placer, un gusto y sobre todo la posibilidad de presentar y discutir algunos resultados de investigación que en el marco de proyectos que hemos venido desarrollando en la frontera sur de México desde hace más de 15 años hemos incluido el tema de trabajo sexual por ser uno de los temas clave para la movilidad poblacional e internacional en la frontera de México con Guatemala, México con Belice, pero después se han extendido estos trabajos hacia las fronteras de Centroamérica y Sudamérica, en donde hemos colaborado con colegas de otras universidades. El proyecto de investigación tiene que ver con la generación de resultados para el diseño de políticas públicas que permitan orientarse al campo de la salud pública en general, pero en una primera instancia esto tuvo un foco importante para la prevención del VIH en estos grupos de población considerados como grupos clave para la prevención de la epidemia. Bueno, solamente un grupo de colegas que está participando en este proyecto, Frida Quintino, Francisco Chong y César Infante, que son colegas investigadores del instituto y que también están en la frontera sur de México. Les decía que el proyecto se enmarca en un proyecto más general que trata de reducir o de contribuir a la reducción de la vulnerabilidad social en salud de este grupo especial de trabajadoras. En esta presentación quiero focalizarla en describir las condiciones sociodemográficas y de salud de las trabajadoras sexuales mexicanas y extranjeras en la frontera sur de México. El espacio en donde se hizo el trabajo de investigación es la región del Soconusco, que es una región fronteriza donde está el principal tránsito de migrantes que provienen de más de 58 países del mundo y que hasta hace pocos meses era la ruta principal para el tránsito de migrantes que buscan llegar hacia Estados Unidos. Esta es la región del Soconusco y hay varios municipios en donde se hicieron los trabajos de investigación. El tema de la movilidad poblacional es un tema clave también aquí porque comienza a ser parte de lo que es el mercado laboral y donde el campo de las actividades terciarias de servicios es importante, pero también el reconocimiento de que hay trabajos marginales y tal vez es uno de los trabajos importantes que representan áreas de marginalidad social y económica también. Se han utilizado, bueno, nosotros utilizamos diferentes estrategias para acercarnos a comprender el fenómeno y junto con colegas antropólogos y sociólogos pudimos entonces hacer una combinación de métodos cualitativos y cuantitativos que nos permitieran aproximarnos de mejor manera a este campo. Hay entrevistas a trabajadoras sexuales, a tomadores de decisiones, pero también hay una encuesta, pero también hay un estudio etnográfico de toda la región. Algunos datos para contextualizar un poco el campo En la muestra, que es una muestra no aleatoria de trabajadoras sexuales, de 400, un poquito más de 400 trabajadoras sexuales, predominaron las trabajadoras sexuales extranjeras de otros países, principalmente centroamericanas. De estas, más jóvenes las mujeres centroamericanas que las mexicanas en términos de edad, y la mayor parte de ellas se concentran en el grupo de edad de los 20 a 29 años de edad. Esta parte respecto a las características y condiciones de su estado civil, bueno, la mayor parte de ellas se declaran como solteras, y la escolaridad promedio entre mexicanas y extranjeras es ligeramente mayor la de las mexicanas, aunque no es estadísticamente significativa, y la mayor parte de ellas dicen tener hijos, 76% de ellas, y la mayor parte de ellas también se asumen como jefas del hogar. Y esta es una parte importante porque los ingresos de estas mujeres van justamente a sus familias. La composición por los países y los lugares de origen, la mayor parte de ellas proviene de zonas marginales urbanas, con historias de vida, de privación económica, de deserción escolar, de violencia, de unión marital, problemas en la unión marital, de unión marital a edad temprana. El principal motivo de migración para el caso de las mujeres centroamericanas es la búsqueda de empleo y mejores condiciones de vida. El 75% de ellas buscan llegar a México como espacio laboral y solamente un 25% buscan llegar a Estados Unidos. La violencia intrafamiliar entre ellas es un fenómeno relativamente frecuente, reportado por el 45% de ellas. En su mayoría, 8 de cada 10 se encuentran en una condición migratoria irregular en México. ¿Cuáles son las condiciones laborales y antecedentes de discriminación y estigma o de violencia en las áreas ya de México? Bueno, ven ustedes que la edad de inicio del trabajo sexual es mucho más joven en el caso de las centroamericanas. Los años dedicados al trabajo sexual es ligeramente mayor también en el caso de las centroamericanas. El lugar de trabajo también entre calle y establecimiento predomina en el caso de las mexicanas ligeramente más el trabajo en la calle. Los meses de trabajo en ese espacio, vean ustedes que es mayor la movilidad de las trabajadoras sexuales en los espacios laborales. Las centroamericanas tienen menor tiempo de duración en estos espacios, las mexicanas son más estables, tienen mayor número de clientes, las centroamericanas también. Y el tema, quiero colocar uno de los principales temas que es de discusión importante, que es el tema del control sanitario que realizan las autoridades municipales de salud a través de una tarjeta de asistencia para consulta médica. En este caso, la mayor parte de las mujeres centroamericanas utilizan este mecanismo para el acceso a los servicios de salud. El 61% de las trabajadoras sexuales mexicanas cuentan con un registro en el sistema de salud municipal de la región fronteriza, y pocas de ellas se perciben discriminadas por su actividad laboral, pero la mayor parte ha sufrido eventos de violencia en el campo laboral en su trabajo. prácticamente la mitad reporta haber presentado algún tipo de violencia. Entre ellas, bueno, pues resalta el tema del sexo también como parte del tema de la violencia sexual en las trabajadoras. Reportan más, el 30% prácticamente de las mujeres centroamericanas, un poco más del 30%, reportan haber sufrido algún tipo de violencia sexual en el campo laboral. Además de agresiones físicas, agresiones psicológicas, etcétera, en contra de ellas. Otro aspecto importante es los elementos o las condiciones de su salud sexual y reproductiva en este campo. Y hay diferencias en algunas, entre mexicanas y extranjeras, en algunas de estas características. Por ejemplo, en el tema de antecedentes de embarazo es más frecuente en las mexicanas. También el promedio de hijos es mayor en las mexicanas. El tema de aborto es mayor en las mexicanas también. El tema de uso de anticonceptivos, ven ustedes, nosotros esperábamos encontrar un acceso mayor a métodos anticonceptivos y no, apenas por arriba de la mitad de ellas utilizan anticonceptivos, y muy pocas de ellas señalan que no lo usan que no usan anticonceptivos por el tema de desconocimiento. Y encontramos en el caso de las centroamericanas el 2.4 de ellas ejerciendo embarazadas y las mexicanas 1.5 también. El uso del condón es muy alto con sus clientes, pero con su pareja es un fenómeno que se ha reportado también de manera importante, es mucho menor. Y en el campo de las enfermedades de transmisión sexual, si uno pensara por dónde está infectándose esta mujer, seguramente sería su pareja sexual regular la que posiblemente podría funcionar como agente transmisor. En el campo de la salud sexual y reproductiva, como señalaba, la mayor parte de ellas han estado embarazadas. El promedio de hijos también es más o menos en la media nacional en México. El tema de los abortos está, la utilización de anticoncepción lo he señalado también, y el campo de los embarazos también. Esta información se utilizó para diseñar un modelo de atención que se distanciara del campo tradicional del control de enfermedades de transmisión sexual, buscando algunos elementos que pudieran favorecer el acceso a salud integral de la mujer. Con un apoyo importante del CENSIDA, que es el Centro Nacional de Prevención del VIH-Sida en México, y el Instituto Nacional de Salud Pública, organizaciones de la sociedad civil, una agencia de estudios en el tema de derecho que es Medilex, y los servicios de salud locales, diseñamos un modelo para intervenir en este campo de atender necesidades de salud. Uno de los obstáculos principales que encontramos fue el reglamento de sanidad municipal, que es un asunto de nivel local y que tiene que ver con la regulación histórica del trabajo sexual. Este reglamento proviene de la época de Maximiliano aquí en México, y lo revisamos y es tal cual este reglamento, con algunas modificaciones en términos generales, pero este es el componente. Diferentes organizaciones participaron en la revisión de este reglamento para darle un enfoque basado en el derecho, buscar una justificación técnica en diferentes notas internacionales y también de CENSIDA, buscar que la condición migratoria no fuera parte de los obstáculos para el acceso a los servicios de salud, y buscar que el examen médico, la atención médica, no se diera solamente para el tema del control de las infecciones de transmisión sexual, y que se diera mucho más en un campo de atención a la salud de la mujer, y buscar también que estos quedaran en términos de registros y supiéramos realmente qué está pasando con la salud y los riesgos que viven estas mujeres. Además, se sugería en su momento un distintivo para aquellos espacios laborales en donde están estas mujeres, en donde fueran espacios libres de violencia, entre comillas, para ellas. Se buscó entonces desarrollar alianzas locales con las organizaciones de la sociedad civil y los servicios de salud. Se hicieron intervenciones comunitarias de sensibilización, se desarrolló un sistema de información sociodemográfica y epidemiológica también, y se llevaron a cabo diferentes actividades preventivas directas con las trabajadoras sexuales. Uno de los avances más importantes fue la reforma del reglamento de sanidad municipal, en donde se integraron estos cambios. Sin embargo, paralelo con eso, se implementó la ley de trata de personas en el estado de Chiapas, y eso simplemente condujo a una parálisis del ordenamiento municipal para adoptar el tema de trata y no seguir esta ruta hacia las facilidades en términos de acceso a servicios de salud. Este fue tal vez uno de los componentes claves, porque al mismo tiempo que se estaba llevando a cabo esta reforma a nivel local, se incide una política de carácter federal que frena este componente importante. ¿Cuáles fueron los efectos inmediatos que nosotros registramos en este campo de acceso a los servicios de salud? Uno es el tema de que les permitieran acceder a información preventiva en salud tanto a mexicanas como a extranjeras. Las azules, las barras azules representan a las mexicanas, las rojas las centroamericanas esencialmente. El tema de acceso a condón, también que tuvieran acceso a condones gratuitos, que estuvieran con acceso a este programa de regulación sanitaria municipal. También me gusta, las extranjeras tienen mucho mayor presencia en este programa, que tuvieran acceso a revisión ginecológica integral también, y que tuvieran acceso a las pruebas de VIH y consejería de manera permanente. Ven ustedes que las cifras, digamos, muestran algunos avances en este campo, aunque estos datos se parecen mucho a otros datos que están en otras regiones del país también. Hay otras pruebas allí que están presentes, el BRL para detectar el tema de sífilis y el tema de Papa Nicolau para cáncer cervicuterino. Estos aspectos fueron aspectos iniciales y fueron completamente detenidos una vez que se implementó el tema de la ley de trata en el estado de Chiapas. Y a partir de allí, además, se documentó una actividad policial muy intensa, focalizada contra las trabajadoras sexuales, en donde el tema de derechos humanos, las violaciones, etcétera, pasaron a ser como un asunto clave también, y donde la respuesta en salud quedó realmente en un campo secundario en esta área, ¿no? Los diarios locales comenzaron a documentar esta serie de eventos, también de estas acciones focalizadas de parte de la policía, bajo el principio de la liberación de mujeres en trata de personas, ¿no? Hubo una respuesta también de parte de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil a nivel local, buscando la protección y el respeto de las mujeres en trabajo sexual. Sin embargo, esto realmente no tuvo un impacto y un alcance como el que se esperaba, y más bien se intensificaron las acciones policíacas focalizadas en este campo. La mayor parte de las mujeres en trabajo sexual migrantes, en ocasiones se utiliza el hecho de que estén trabajando como trabajadoras sexuales indocumentadas para ser deportadas a sus países. Y este es un área también muy importante, porque la propia ley de trata se supone que es parte de los elementos que podría contribuir a proteger. ¿Cuáles son los retos que identificamos en estos momentos? Bueno, uno es el tema de las condiciones cambiantes ahora mismo en la frontera sur de México, tanto laborales como sociales. La mayor parte de los bares en donde laboraban estas mujeres han cerrado, y este es un fenómeno que ha dispersado a las trabajadoras, y en este momento la posibilidad de acceder a los servicios de salud es muy baja. Hay el problema de tratar estos riesgos en salud y de acceso a servicios de salud entre mexicanas y extranjeras. Suponemos nosotros que en este momento las extranjeras tienen menor probabilidad de utilizar servicios de salud que las mexicanas, dadas las características de organización de nuestros servicios de salud. El tema del manejo efectivo de los riesgos, que como ven ustedes se estaba comenzando a implementar de manera intensiva allí, prácticamente está paralizado también. El tema del trabajo sexual se coloca ahora como un tema no reconocido, y además un acto criminal que tiene que ser penalizado. Y por supuesto, en este marco, el tema de el respeto a los derechos humanos a estos grupos en condición de alta vulnerabilidad social, pues representa realmente uno de los retos principales en la política, no solo de salud, sino tal vez en la política tal vez más integral que se tiene que atender en este campo en México. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, después de las presentaciones vamos a dar paso al comentarista de la mesa, es el doctor Mario Luis Fuentes, es doctor por la Universidad de Anglia del Este en Reino Unido, maestro en desarrollo regional por el Instituto de Estudios Sociales de la Universidad de La Haya, Holanda, y licenciado en Economía por el ITAM. Es integrante de la Junta de Gobierno de la UNAM, coordinador de la especialización en desarrollo social del posgrado de la Facultad de Economía, investigador del programa de estudios sobre derecho y titular de la cátedra extraordinaria Trata de Personas de la UNAM, director del CEIDAS y director de la revista México Social y conductor del programa México Social.
Muchas gracias y sobre todo porque me permite reaccionar a las excelentes ponencias que se han presentado en el foro. No voy a abordar una a una, voy a tomar de algunos puntos que creo puedo resaltar de toda la reflexión que se ha hecho. Déjame empezar por la última que René hace. Lo que nos transmite que la imposición o el surgimiento de esta visión de la ley de trata más punitiva que preventiva o de protección, el efecto que tiene en las otras áreas del gobierno. O sea, no solo es un tema en sí mismo, sino inhibe y minimiza la acción, en este caso de salud pública, de tal manera que no solo es un efecto único, sino múltiple, porque obviamente reduce la acción, la capacidad de incidencia y obviamente nuevamente entramos en una reflexión que creo que durante toda la mañana se hizo, la simplificación de quién es víctima, quién es victimario. O sea, la enorme necesidad de ir más allá incluso de los trabajos y las investigaciones etnográficas para realmente reconocer que actualmente, pese a Palermo, pese a que en México ha habido dos leyes, está en discusión otra, sigue habiendo una enorme confusión o no claridad en esta noción de tratar de establecer estos absolutos, quién es víctima, quién es victimario, y en esta noción que se cruza, y creo que las dos reflexiones que hace tanto Kevin y Sin y Edrak es que el tema de las identidades se puede sin duda durante la mañana, durante la tarde participar en el comercio sexual y en la tarde o el fin de semana tener otro rol. Y nuevamente esta realidad de que el concepto de identidad es un concepto resbaloso, decía Barman cuando hablaba de su libro Los indígenas de México. Y nuevamente esta identidad múltiple que todos tenemos y que muchas veces el legislador o el ejecutivo tiende a privilegiar una y volver un absoluto. Una persona se dedica al comercio sexual 24 horas, 7 días, 365, desconociendo la enorme diversidad y heterogeneidad de las identidades y en ese sentido nuevamente reduciendo conceptos a su mínima expresión o usando conceptos que decía el sociólogo Bowman, conceptos que se vuelven zombies, o sea, no transmiten la diversidad y heterogeneidad y simplemente los usamos por costumbre. En ese sentido, surge con mucha fuerza el impacto que esta visión abolicionista que ha impulsado la criminalización del comercio sexual, en los casos que hemos visto, obviamente tiende a esta enorme negación de pensar los mundos del trabajo, la realidad que, como nos decía alguno de los testimonios que nos hacía Saint Planchet y nos decía Kevin, es de que para muchas personas el trabajo sexual es no solo similar a otro tipo de trabajo, puede ser menos punitivo, menos riesgoso, menos agresivo a su dignidad, y eso nos pone en términos de una de las dimensiones ignoradas en la discusión de la trata, la discusión de los mercados laborales, su enorme tendencia, no solo a la precarización, que es una palabra economicista, sino a la enorme violencia laboral que se da en los mercados globales, y creo que nuevamente queda ignorada la discusión que nos lleva simplemente a hablar sobre las víctimas. En ese sentido hay un tema, yo creo que mayor, cuando se ejerce una agencia activa o pasiva cuando hay una capacidad de tomar decisiones. Y nuevamente esta discusión entre que muchas de las agencias que se realizan por los individuos pues responden a las pocas opciones o a las alternativas que tienen, que nuevamente nos pone en esta discusión central de la criminalización de las víctimas cuando muchas veces están haciendo uso de una agencia pasiva que les da los entornos sociales. Un tema que surge y una palabra que está ahí es la vulnerabilidad. Yo parto y insisto, y son los conceptos que necesitamos introducir. ¿Qué hace a un individuo, qué convierte a un individuo que tenga una alta o baja vulnerabilidad para ser objeto de todas las violencias, incluso trata? Y obviamente ahí está, y lo dibujan las posiciones, la ruptura de todos estos entornos institucionales privados y públicos que deberían generar los sistemas de protección de derechos que no existen. La ruptura del hogar, la ruptura de las escuelas, la ruptura de la comunidad. Pues la vulnerabilidad no es un tema de género, de edad o de etnia, sino tiene que ver con la enorme ausencia, fractura de los sistemas institucionales que los individuos deberíamos tener para construir el bien preciado cuando se habla de la infancia, el desarrollo de la personalidad de los individuos. Y ahí está otro tema, ¿cuál es el bien preciado que se está buscando proteger en cada una de las visiones que hoy se confrontan y que obviamente ponen en el centro cuáles son las causas de la vulnerabilidad, cómo se han incrementado y cómo estas realmente, cuando hablamos de la población migrante, la población migrante no documentada, pues observan procesos de vulnerabilidad y de violencia. Uno de los datos que puso René es este dato de que la discriminación pareciera ser, por lo menos en la estadística, es muy baja, y abajo es la violencia. Obviamente es cuando entramos a estas dimensiones de la subjetividad que tiene la discriminación en términos de este reconocimiento que incluso las mujeres de Nigeria, creo que nos decían, no existe una estigma o una carga negativa por dedicarse al comercio sexual. No, existen otras que se conjuntan y que obviamente nos ponen intención de que bajo este argumento o estos datos, viéndolos con todo el cuidado y con toda su enorme simplificación que nos da una encuesta, pues el tema de la discriminación parece ser que nuevamente se nos pierde como un acto de violencia, más en un país como el nuestro, en que el racismo es realmente una de las formas brutales que estigmatiza y señala y nuevamente nos mete al tema de identidades. ¿Qué le impone el tema? Uno de los temas que nuevamente siempre en los temas de trata es el discurso. ¿Quiénes son las víctimas? Mujeres jóvenes, blancas, que son seducidas por alguien malo y de pronto surge esta visión heroica de alguna organización o incluso gobiernos a través de sus leyes o legisladoras a través de sus leyes que tratan de salvar a este discurso de que nos generó un imaginario de quiénes son las víctimas. Y obviamente hay un elemento que está, ¿quién genera este imaginario de quién son las víctimas? Y nuevamente hay un elemento que tendríamos que imponer, porque muchas de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil, incluso los gobiernos que actúan también promovidos por las visiones de los que fondean este tipo de actividades. Ya hablo del Departamento de Estado de los Estados Unidos, que genera fondeos y que genera estas visiones de qué es la víctima, qué tipo de víctima. Y hoy tenemos esta enorme énfasis en el último informe del GTIP que se presentó, en que se hace un énfasis de trabajar sobre la víctima. Y obviamente extrapola toda una visión que Kevin nos presentaba en términos de este relato, que simplifica. Si algo yo recojo es la enorme realidad de una simplificación del tema de trata, una enorme tensión todavía, casi 14 años de Palermo, de no poder tener claridad quién es víctima de trata, quién es víctima de otras violencias. Y esta búsqueda de que todos son víctimas de trata, con los riesgos que tiene, porque entonces vuelven o sujetos a su protección, y si no lo aceptan, entonces son parte del crimen que él genera. este relato que ha habido aquí en México, de que cuando hay una redada en un table dance de la ciudad, los policías preguntan, ¿usted es víctima? Dice, no. Si no es usted víctima, es victimaria, entonces usted pase para acá. No, entonces soy víctima. O sea, y este enorme descuido del legislador, que cuando se puso la palabra quien facilita el crimen de trata se vuelve tan objeto de la penalidad, tanto como el que tiene beneficios económicos mayores. Entonces, sin duda, esto nos abre esta dimensión, pero obviamente el marco conceptual que tenemos para la interpretación y este discurso que ha invisibilizado a los hombres, que ha invisibilizado a los transexuales, y que genera todo un discurso en el cual se asume que cualquier ser humano que se dedica al comercio sexual es una persona que es víctima de trata, y obviamente tiene que ver con un tema. Si el indicador de éxito es número de víctimas rescatadas, pues obviamente todo el mundo busca tener el mayor número de víctimas como el indicador. No sabemos cuántos de estas personas fueron reintegradas a espacios, digamos, de poder construir su agencia con dignidad. Y un tema que surge, y lo toco porque sin duda son los temas necesarios a revisar, es la deportación. Una cantidad de distintos seres humanos que cometen algún delito en algún país extranjero y son deportados a sus países de origen, que son objetos entonces de una mayor violencia. Y ya en los perímetros, llámese frontera norte de México, frontera sur, o llámese Nigeria, en el cual atrapadas, digamos, en un mundo, en su mundo local, en el cual la deportación se convierte en un acto que genera este nivel de violencia mayor. Creo que hoy, estamos enfrentando esta pregunta que surge en varios de los testimonios o reflexiones que nos han compartido. ¿Qué origina las violencias? O sea, la violencia es consecuencia de la acción que ha criminalizado una actividad de distintos seres humanos, y eso en un marco de impunidad, en un marco de una enorme cultura que vulnera a los individuos que están en la transgresión del marco normativo, y que ha generado esta enorme violencia ahora institucional, y es una violencia mayor cuando el Estado la genera. Y por otra parte, esta realidad de pensar estos temas en la globalización, en la enorme complejidad de las migraciones, y que obviamente genera que individuos abusen, aprovechen de la vulnerabilidad de los otros en la ruptura adicional de estados que no son creíbles o no tienen las capacidades para establecer un estado de derecho como concepto central que permitiría garantizar por lo menos una mayor violencia institucional o una mayor violencia de los individuos. La pregunta de fondo, que es una pregunta mayor, es ¿cuáles son los motores, las pulsiones, diría Freud, ¿sí?, que llevan esta violencia absurda? Y ahí, déjeme simplemente dejarlo ahí, parece ser que los testimonios, haciendo la acotación de que mucho de lo que sabemos de trata se debe a testimonios, y eso nos pone en una situación muy límite, no realmente tenemos comprensión de todo el fenómeno. Pareciera que no solo es el caso de trata, no es solo el intercambio de un bien, llámese el cuerpo de otro individuo a través de un intercambio comercial, sino hay una dimensión, una pulsión que implica el sometimiento de otro ser humano, volverlo su esclavo, como una de las pulsiones mayores que pueden explicar esta dimensión del mal radical, diría otra dimensión, que genera esta enorme pulsión de sometimiento, someter y obligar a una persona a que haga lo que no se desea, independientemente de que haya un intercambio, es la posesión absoluta de un ser humano en esta lógica de un consumo al extremo, en el cual puede ser, lo planteo como hipótesis, que el tema de un sometimiento absoluto de un ser humano sea una de las pulsiones que explique esta mar de violencias, estos océanos de violencias que hoy, ante esta actitud moral que establece que cualquier ser humano que se dedica a intercambiar su cuerpo por otros bienes, uno se simplifica en términos de que es un mal y como tal debe ser criminalizado y combatido, generando una mayor vulneración de estos seres humanos. Muchas gracias y felicidades a los ponentes.